Chapter 5 of In the Field, 1914-1915. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by FNH. In the Field, 1914-1915, by Marcel Dupont. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Low Mass and Benediction. One morning in the middle of September 1914, as we raised our heads at about 6 o'clock from the straw on which we had slept, I and my friend F. had a very disagreeable surprise. We heard in the darkness the gentle, monotonous noise of water falling drop by drop from the penthouse roof on to the road. Arriving at Pévy the evening before, just before midnight, we had found refuge in a house belonging to a peasant. The hostess, a good old soul of 80, had placed at our disposal a small bare room paved with tiles, in which our orderlies had prepared a sumptuous bed of trusses of straw. The night had been delightful, and we should have been awakened in good spirits had it not been for the distressing fact noticed by my friend. "It is raining," said F. I could not but agree with him. Those who have been soldiers, and especially cavalrymen, know to the full how dispiriting is the sound of those few words. It is raining. It is raining means your clothes will be saturated, your cloak will be drenched, and weigh at least 40 pounds. The water will drip from your shako along your neck and down your back. Above all, your high boots will be transformed into two little pools in which your feet paddle woefully. It means broken roads, mud splashing you up in the eyes, horses slipping, reins stiffening, your saddle transformed into a hip bath. It means that the little clean linen you had brought with you, that precious treasure, in your saddle bags, will be changed into a wet bundle on which large and indelible yellow stains have been made by the soaked leather. But it was no use to think of all this. The orders ran, "Horses to be saddled and squadron ready to mount at 6:30," and they had to be carried out. It was still dark. I went out into the yard, after pulling down my campaigning cap over my ears. Well, after all, the evil was less than I had feared. It was not raining, but drizzling. The air was mild, and there was not a breath of wind. When once our cloaks were on, it would take some hours for the wet to reach our shirts. At the farther end of the yard some men were moving about around a small fire. Their shadows passed to and fro in front of the ruddy light. They were making coffee, jus, as they call it, that indispensable ration in which they soak bread and make a feast without which they think a man cannot be a good soldier. I ran to my troop through the muddy alleyways, skipping from side to side to avoid the puddles. Daylight appeared, pale and dismal. A faint smell rose from the sodden ground. "Nothing new, mon Lieutenant," were the words that greeted me from the sergeant, who had then made his report. I had every confidence in him. He had been some years in the service and knew his business. Small and lean, and tightly buttoned into his tunic, in spite of all our trials, he was still the typical smart light cavalry non-commissioned officer. I knew he had already gone round the stables, which he did with a candle in his hand, patting the horse's haunches and looking with a watchful eye to see whether some limb had not been hurt by a kick or entangled in its tether. In the large yard of the abandoned and pillaged farm where the men had been billeted, they were hurrying to fasten the last buckles and take their places in the ranks. I quickly swallowed my portion of insipid, lukewarm coffee brought me by my orderly. Then I went to get my orders from the Captain, who was lodged in the market square. No word had yet been received from the Colonel, who was quartered at a farm in Vadiville, 2 kilometres off. Patience. We had been used to these long waits since the army had been pulled up before the formidable line of trenches which the Germans had dug north of Reims. They were certainly most disheartening, but it could not be helped, and it was no use to complain. I turned and went slowly up the steep footpath that led to my billet. Pévy is a poor little village, clinging to the last slopes of a line of heights that runs parallel to the road from Reims to Paris. Its houses are huddled together, and seem to be grouped at the foot of the ridges for protection from the north wind. The few alleys which intersect the village climb steeply up the side of the hill. We were obliged to tramp about in the sticky mud of the main road waiting for our orders. Passing the church, it occurred to me to go and look inside. Since the war had begun we had hardly had any opportunity of going into the village churches we had passed. Some of them were closed because the parish priests had left for the army, or because the village had been abandoned to the enemy. Others had served as marks for the artillery, and now stood in the middle of the villages, ruins loftier and more pitiable than the rest. The church of Pévy seemed to be clinging to the side of the hill, and was approached by a narrow stairway of greyish stone, climbing up between moss-grown walls. I first passed through the modest little churchyard, with its humble tombs half hidden in the grass, and read some of the simple inscriptions. Here lies, pray for him. The narrow pathway leading to the porch was almost hidden in the turf, and as I walked up it my boots brushed the drops from the grass. The damp seemed to be getting into my bones, for it was still drizzling, a fine persistent drizzle. Behind me the village was in mist. The roofs and the maze of chimney tops were hardly distinguishable. Passing through a low, dark porch, I opened the heavy door studded with iron nails and entered the church, and at once experienced a feeling of relaxation, of comfort and repose. How touching the little sanctuary of Pévy seemed to me in its humble simplicity. Imagine a kind of hall with bare walls, the vault supported by 2 rows of thick pillars. The narrow Gothic windows hardly allowed the grey light to enter. There were no horrible, cheap, modern stained windows, but a multitude of small, white, rectangular leaded panes. All this was simple and worn, but to me it seemed to breathe a noble and touching poetry. And what charmed me above all was that the pale light did not reveal walls covered with horrible colour wash we are accustomed to see in most of our village churches. This church was an old one, a very old one. Its style was not very well defined, for it had no doubt been built, damaged, destroyed, rebuilt and repaired by many different generations. But those who preserved it to the present day had avoided the lamentable plastering which disfigures so many others. The walls were built with fine large stones, on which time had left its melancholy impress. There was no grotesque painting on them to mar their quiet beauty, and the dim light that filtered through at that early hour gave them a vague soft glow. No pictures or ornaments disfigured the walls. The Stations of the Cross were the only adornment, and they were so simple and childish in their execution that they were no doubt the work of some rustic artist, and even this added a touching note to a harmonious whole. But my attention was attracted by a slight noise, a kind of soft and monotonous murmur coming from the altar. The choir was almost in darkness, but I could distinguish the 6 stars of lighted candles. In front of the tabernacle was standing a large white shadowy form, almost motionless and like a phantom. At the bottom of the steps another form was kneeling, bowed down towards the floor. It did not stir as I approached. I went towards the choir on tiptoe, very cautiously. I felt that I, a profane person, was committing a sacrilege by coming to disturb these 2 men praying there all alone in the gloom of that sad morning. A deep feeling of emotion passed through me, and I felt so insignificant in their presence and in the mysterious atmosphere of that place that I knelt down humbly, almost timidly, in the shadow of one of the great pillars near the altar. Then I could distinguish my fellow worshippers better. A priest was saying Mass. He was young and tall, and his gestures as he officiated were slow and dignified. He did not know that someone was present watching him closely, so it could not be supposed that he was speaking and acting to impress a congregation, and yet he had a way of kneeling, of stretching out his arms, and of looking up to the humble gilded cross in front of him that revealed all the ardour of fervent prayers. Occasionally he turned towards the back of the church to pronounce the ritual words. His face was serious and kindly, framed in a youthful beard, the face of an apostle, with the glow of faith in his eyes, and I was surprised to see underneath the priest's vestments the hems of a pair of red trousers, and feet shod in large muddy military boots. The kneeling figure at the bottom of the steps now stood out more distinctly. The man was wearing on his shabby infantry coat the white armlet of the Red Cross. He must have been a priest, for I could still distinguish some traces of the neglected tonsure among his brown hair. The 2 repeated in low tone by turns the words of the prayer, comfort, repentance or supplication, harmonious Latin phrases, which sounded to me like exquisite music. And as an accompaniment in the distance, in the direction of Saint Thierry and Berry-au-Bac, the deep voice of the guns muttered ceaselessly. For the first time in the campaign I felt a kind of poignant melancholy. For the first time I felt small and miserable, almost a useless thing, compared with his